Put your head on right Well, come on, let's get it here.
Well, I'm very happy, first of all, to see such a crowd. It's really nice to see such a turnout. Today we have a very interesting speaker, and he has written a most interesting book about the Balkans. And it's not only about the Macedonian, about say just the Macedonian question and cause, but it's about a very general also question. It's about the what it struck me the most is the denial of the other. So I think we will hear quite a bit about it from Mr. Reed. Well, the other thing is I wanted to say is ако има некој прашање на македонски, прашате на македонски или некој од нас или јас ќе преведам. Ако сакате нешто да се разјасни пак на македонски, ова е сепак за Македонија, бидете слободни, кажете на македонски. I was just saying to the people, if somebody wants to say something in Macedonian, ask the question, we'll be happy to translate, or if they want to be explained, we'll do that as well. Well, I would really, we have the pleasure here to have Mr. Fred Reed here with us, and I would like to present Mr. Reed.
I hope you don't mind if I sit down.
To read before you start, it's very hard to hear back here, so yell.
Well, you've got a microphone.
Am I speaking loudly enough now? Can you all hear me at the mic?
Is your mic on?
I'm just trying to give the cameraman a hard time, and apparently succeeding. Can you hear me now if I speak at this level? That's okay. Could I ask for a glass of water?
Sure.
If I have to speak loud, I'm going to need it. Huh? Okay. Huh?
Yeah.
It's been suggested that I stand up, so I'm going to do it. This is better? Okay. I don't know if you want to see this, but at least you can hear better. Before I begin my talk, which I hope will stimulate a lively discussion between us afterward and plenty of questions, I want to thank the Canadian Macedonian Historical Society for its very generous invitation, and also my intrepid publisher Talon Books for making it possible for me to be here with you today. In fact, this particular invitation goes back to last fall when I was in Toronto to speak to two other Macedonian groups and to launch my now sub-famous and semi-notorious book, Salonica Terminus, which is displayed here. Back then, the audience seemed to like what I had to say and bombarded me with questions. And after the questions, I signed books until my fingers ached. I don't want you to get me wrong, however. I'm happy to sign as many books as you care to throw in my direction. In any case, amongst the din and the furor back then, someone slipped me a scribbled note asking if I would accept an invitation to speak to the organization that is our host today, the Canadian Macedonian Historical Society. Of course, my answer was a hastily scrawled yes in capital letters. So here I am, and I'm very happy to be here.
That's a big one.
Thank you. I'll need them both. Before I forget, and this is probably the most important thing, I want to thank the Toronto Macedonian community as a whole and at large for the support that it's given my book. My publisher, who is supposed to know about these matters, has told me that response has been nothing short of phenomenal. I believe him, and I can't begin to tell you how touched I am to see that Salonica Terminus has struck a sympathetic chord. I'm also pleased in a more down-to-earth, material way, as you can certainly imagine. Today's talk has been billed as a question. That's the kind of approach I like best. Why indeed would a former American who lives in Montreal and considers himself an adopted Quebecois want to write a book about Salonica, Solun as you call it, about the southern Balkans, and more importantly on the big region that lies around it? I hope that today's talk will slightly clarify matters, but not too much, because after all, we must never take anything for granted, and too much clarity may be dangerous. You know, it's getting to be a habit. I mean, coming to Toronto to talk to people about who they are. First, it was the Iranians who were pleased that my previous book, Persian Postcards, did not treat them or their country as fanatical, crazy, or bloodthirsty. Then came you, the Macedonians. Once again, as in November, I find myself talking to an intelligent, sensitive audience about a situation it understands far better than I do. I admit it, there is an element of foolhardiness in speaking to people about themselves, particularly when the semi-forbidden Macedonian question is involved. But that's a risk I knew I was getting into from the start. I don't like to run away from risks, but still, overall, I prefer caution. The best I can hope to do, I think, is to share with you my experience and my ignorance. Hopefully you'll bear with me and not make a rush for the exits to demand your money back. Ignorance, like historical truth, is a relative thing, after all. In writing about faraway, unfashionable subjects like Iran, or like Macedonia, I've tried to demonstrate that an average person, a non-specialist, a non-academic, an anti-expert, can learn much in a relatively short time. And not only that, he or she can transmit some of the knowledge gained in such a way as to pique the curiosity of readers, to cause them to ask more questions. This is why I began writing books in the first place. Not to share ignorance, but to seek knowledge together with kindred souls, my readers. And hopefully with you who have taken the time and the trouble to come and listen to me this afternoon. Under no circumstances can I pretend that I've even been able to tap the massive information available on the so-called Macedonian question. Although since my last visit here, I've had a chance to read Lilian Petrov's compelling study of Toronto's Macedonian community, and Loring Danforth's exhaustive overview of the Macedonian identity in the communities of the diaspora, here, Australia, as well as in Greece. Both are excellent works and have encouraged me in believing that my perspective in Salonica Terminus is a fair one. I also want to say in my own defense that I have also encountered experts in this question whom I have found to be, like all too many specialists, rather too narrow in their focus. In order to understand what has happened, what is happening, and what may happen in Macedonia, we also need quite the opposite. We need a broad view, a view that is accessible to the general public, a view that takes into account the complexity of the issue, the power of the emotions that it generates, and the power of history. Though some of you have already read Salonica Terminus, I'd still like to read you a few pages from the preface to give a better idea of what I'm talking about. The Balkans today are the bastard child of the Ottoman Empire and Western imperialism. The name of the region derives from the Turkish word for mountain. It is, for the most part, a mass of rugged, irregular ranges which have exerted a determining influence on social, economic, and political development. Until recently, the peninsula was administered not by nation-states, but by two multinational empires, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. What set the Balkans apart from Western Europe was that the peoples who settled there had been able to preserve their identity down to the present. When, driven by the flood tide of nationalism which arose early in the 19th century and has yet to crest, the identity of one began to impinge on that of the other, the result was predictably disastrous. Conventional wisdom tells us, as do expert analysts and mainstream journalists, that the latest Balkan catastrophe, which began in the early 1990s with the collapse of Yugoslavia and the violent partition of Bosnia, was the work of a handful of ruthless, power-hungry regional demagogues wielding nationalism as the grim reaper wields his scythe. It was as if the rational West could not bear to hear of blood enmity, of ancient hatred, of myth, those building stones of its own cultural identity. Yet my travels in the southern Balkans persuade me that the failure of Yugoslavia is not simply the gruesome work of Slobodan Milosevic or Franjo Tudjman, even though it is that too. The agony of Bosnia, the Damoclean sword suspended above the head of Macedonia, the coming upheaval in Kosovo, are not merely the heritage of Tito's Yugoslavia, though they are that too. Tito's was the second attempt to construct, on the basis of the mutual consent of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, a state of the South Slavs, which also encompassed non-consenting Albanians. The first Yugoslavia was founded in 1918. Its borders and the status of its minorities were legitimized by the Peace of Versailles, Europe and America's poisoned gift to humanity. Synthesis of Wilson's 14 points and great power greed. It collapsed 20 years later amidst the debris of dictatorship as Nazi Germany thrust southeastward into the Balkans, setting up an independent fascist Croat state as it went, a development uncannily reflected in Christian democratic Germany's hasty recognition of an independent Croatia in 1991. Events in Albania, occupied by fascist Italy, followed a similar course. Nationalism, as much a creature of the Enlightenment as the world culture which now bids to replace it, had already been at work for decades, transmitted by the codification of national languages and the creation of national histories and pedigrees. Nationalism and the passions it released was also the sword wielded by the European powers, France, England, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia, in their mortal struggle against the Ottoman Empire and in their expansionist drive to capture new markets. Had the Ottomans actively proselytized for Islam and had not Ottoman misrule provided it with the fertile ground of rancor and poverty, nationalism of such particular virulence might less likely have taken root in the Balkans. But they didn't, and it did. There was more. Oil, the viscous black liquid that lights men's eyes and kindles their avarice, lay beyond the end station of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, across the shipping lanes that radiated from Salonica Harbor, the great Balkan terminus. The once feared empire, whose capital spanned 2 continents, stood as the great barrier blocking European access to the newly discovered petroleum resources of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. There, the precious commodity which lay beneath the sand was soon to be portioned out by men meeting in secret chambers, Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot. The Ottomans represented yet another encumbrance. They were Muslims. Weak, corrupt Muslims, to be sure, but bearers of a creed that posits a non-national model of social organization. Ottoman cities, in comparison with the mode prevailing in Europe, were havens of cosmopolitan tolerance, places where people of all 3 monotheistic religions and of a huge diversity of languages and ethnic attachments coexisted in relative peace. These cities had names like Üsküp, Sarajevo, and Salonik. As the empire withered, driven south and eastward by encroaching oil-thirsty Europe and devoured from within by a virulent strain of Turkish nationalism, Sarajevo, Salonika, and Skopje survived like islands on the land. Capital of tiny, fragile, landlocked, and debt-ridden Macedonia, Skopje still preserves its national ambiguity and multi-ethnic harmony, but jagged fault lines run just beneath the surface. Sarajevo is a smoking ruin, the head of a corpse being systematically picked apart by the vultures of the international financial establishment. Salonika, second city of 2 empires, once known as the Sepharad of the Balkans, had long ago been reduced in a long spasm of exclusion and ethnic cleansing to a unidimensional provincial capital. The journeys through the Balkans, which form the armature of this book, begin and end in the city on Salonika Bay. There, I hypothesized, I would find keys to the calamity of Sarajevo and insight into the future of Skopje, perhaps even penetrate the secret of Macedonia. Acting on Edward Said's admonition, I did not accept the politics of identity as given, but attempted to show how representations are constructed, for what purpose, and with what components. I think we can all agree on one thing. Macedonia may be a miniature problematical country, but it encloses a universal dimension and expresses a universal dilemma. Of course, the problem is not simply how we see and imagine ourselves. That would be too easy. Things only really become complicated when those who look upon us from outside, when those who imagine us, begin to define us, for better or for worse, often worse. And particularly if those looking on, or doing the imagining, are doing so from a position of power and domination. I hope it's clear from what I've argued so far that Salonica Terminus is more than a travel book, although it is that too. Most of all, it is an attempt to see the entire southern Balkan region from the perspective I've just outlined, to see it as a place that is very far from us as Canadians, yet very near to us as well, and not only because we may be of Macedonian or Greek or Albanian descent. But before we head off down that path, let me share with you some of the reasons that led me on my voyage of discovery into Macedonia and my discovery of the Macedonians. When I went to Iran for the first time 12 years ago, I was determined to see for myself this country, which the Western media had unanimously labeled a land of terrorists and fanatics. As a journalist and as a writer, I felt it was my duty to show the complexity, talk of the ambiguity, present a fully rounded picture and not simply look for evidence to corroborate some pre-established ideological or political agenda. Even more, to offer a contrary view, a challenge to the self-defined wisdom of the political establishment and its media courtiers, most of whom are nothing but talking press releases in any case. Speaking of Iran, from whence I've just returned, you may be interested to know that there may soon be a Persian language version of this book, Salonica Terminus, appearing in Tehran, where interest in Balkan issues is high and sympathy for countries like Macedonia is strong. Anyway, in my book, I wanted to bring the same focus to bear on Macedonia and the Macedonians as I did on their neighbors, the Albanians, and of course the Greeks. And while we're on the subject of Greece, perhaps more detail is in order. Some of it slightly autobiographical, if you'll forgive me. I went to that country for the first time in 1960 and lived there for 3 years. Just a few days after the assassination in Salonika of Grigoris Lambrakis, I left. That assassination, if you'll recall, was the event that touched off the downhill slide toward the dictatorship of the fascist junta in 1974. For those 7 miserable years, I made it a point of honor not to travel to Greece and was an active supporter of the movement against the dictatorship in Montreal. But looking back now, I detect a coincidence. My curiosity about Salonika, a curiosity that was further stimulated by reading the works of writers like Yorgos Ioannou, Tolis Kazantzis, and Elias Petropoulos, has remained alive since the Lambrakis assassination. The anonymous statue marking the spot of the cowardly act was one of the first places I visited when I returned there to do research on this book in 1994. Ever since 1974, when the junta collapsed, I've been traveling regularly to Greece, alone and with my family. I consider Greece to be my country. Greece's heritage is that of mankind in general. I read, speak, and write its language. I love its poetry, its literature, and its music. I've translated books by many of its finest authors, including the great Nikos Kazantzakis, whose best-known book, Zorba the Greek, should perhaps have been entitled Zorba the Macedonian. Don't tell anybody I said that. But as any partner in a serious long-term relationship, I also came to realize that the Greeks, just like the rest of us, are human beings with human weaknesses and failings, a fact which is reflected in Greek society as it is in any other society. I also began to understand that the Greek state, like its counterparts everywhere, has no morality, only interests. Of course, most of you are probably asking yourselves why it took me so long to figure this out. Anyway, wisdom comes late. Even so, when Yugoslavia collapsed and the former Socialist Republic of Macedonia voted powerfully for independence, I was first puzzled, then shocked at Greece's response. By the way, let me add parenthetically that when I speak of Greece or the Greeks, I'm speaking of the Greek state, not of the Greek people themselves, for whose cultural achievements I have the highest esteem. You've all heard the official Greek argument time and time again, and the argument is undoubtedly a painful one to hear, so I won't burden you with it even so much as a summary. In any case, the Greek authorities lack neither the money nor the ability to put their case before the public, and they never miss the opportunity to do so. But let me tell you this. When someone tells me that the man or the woman I see standing over there do not exist, I become curious. When someone tells me with perfect assurance that the language that the man and the woman are speaking doesn't exist either, I become more curious still. And when someone claims that these non-existent people are a threat to themselves, then I become truly curious. Such at the time was the prevailing attitude in Greece. It may have been understandable, but it was extraordinary. Our job as journalists is to be curious. It's our business to look at the other side of things, to investigate claims like those I've just described, to see if the non-existent man and woman are really nothing but a figment of their own imagination, to find out what it is that they are speaking. So that's the starting point of my travels into the Macedonian subsection of the Balkan nightmare. I already knew something about the Greek Civil War. I'd always been half aware of Greece's, quote, Slav-speaking, unquote, minority. But my first awakening to its real existence came 5 years ago when my wife and I were on holiday in northern Greece around Kastoria and Florina, which I believe are also called Kostur and Lerin. There we heard people speaking a language that was not Greek, not Shkip, not Arumani, not Russian, not Turkish, not Serbian. Some Greeks told us it was a dialect, a patois. But a dialect of what? No one would say. As I was to find out later, it was that non-existent language, many of whose speakers still dare not say their name. On later trips, when I attempted to find out about this subject in Greece, particularly in Salonica, people seemed to get upset. Eyes would suddenly turn hard, laughter would come quickly to a halt. In tavernas and coffee houses, glasses and cups would quickly find their way to the tabletops. The atmosphere would start to chill right down. Incomprehensibly for me, there were preemptive attacks. Friends and acquaintances would talk darkly of insults to their philotimo. Of course, the last thing I would ever do is insult anyone's philotimo. Things got so bad that I found it impossible to say the M word. If I wanted to describe the country to the immediate north, I had to say Skopje. The more enlightened would accept Fyrom, of course. But to say Macedonia was tantamount in Greece to legitimizing a nebulous potential claim on the country's sacred land, to transforming Alexander the Great into Gotze Delchev. I was told point blank to be careful what I wrote, and by extension, what I should think. I want to add parenthetically that no one in Tehran ever told me that. To be fair, it was clear that feelings on this subject were running very high in Greece back then, much more so than they are today, I hope. The embargo has been lifted, and both sides have made conciliatory gestures, even though the core issue, the existence of a Macedonian minority within Greece's borders, remains unrecognized and unsolved. But I don't think the problem will go away until attitudes change, and I'm inclined to believe that it is in Greece that they must change. And unlikely as this may seem today, such a change, I hope, cannot be entirely ruled out. Let's be fair. If history shows anything, it is that myth and legend are just as true as provable fact, perhaps even more so. Greece had managed to convince itself, and most of its citizens, though not all of them, that the existence of a country called Macedonia was a direct threat to the identity of northern Greece, which the Greeks also call Macedonia. At a demonstration in Salonica several years ago, more than 1 million people shouted in Greek, Macedonia is Greek. Can a million Greeks be wrong? Right you are if you think you are, said Luigi Pirandello, the playwright. He wasn't wrong. No matter how wrong the demonstrators were, or may have been, they were convinced that they were right. That's what we have to deal with. So as I went along, it became clear that I had two jobs before me, not one. The first was to test the non-existence theory. The second was to examine why this issue touched off such powerful feelings in Greece, particularly since it came from a non-existent people in a non-existent land, a never-never land, a through-the-looking-glass land. So while I devoted 2 chapters in my book to exploring the Macedonian question, I spent much of the rest of it scrutinizing the process by which Greece created the powerful sense of itself that we see around us today, in all its strengths and in all its weaknesses, in all its pride and in all its arrogance. I hope this provides some satisfaction to those of you who have felt aggrieved at having to plow through 5 chapters of Salonica Terminus before getting to the Macedonian parts. Since I was last in Toronto, Several copies of this book have reached Greece, and comments are beginning to filter back. One friend, a very dear friend, wrote that the book sounded like the whining of a lover who's just been jilted by his girlfriend. Another, much more serious, suggested that it suffers from a lack of relativism. I think the criticism is a fair one. To single out Greece for special treatment, as I have done, is to overlook the abuses that have taken place in the name of the national ideal in every other Balkan country. I'm sure we'll all agree that there's no guarantee that if Macedonia survives as a country, it can escape the temptation of turning on the other within or without. But to my Greek friends, whose opinion I value very highly, I say this. Greece, as the most powerful country in the southern Balkans, both economically and militarily, is now and has been in a position of dominance. Macedonians have suffered much more at the hands of Greeks than Greeks at the hands of Macedonians. Greece is a well-established state, and now seeking full integration into the European Union. But still it declines to properly enforce the human rights conventions of which it is a signatory. Greece possesses a vocal, well-oiled propaganda apparatus and a large, aggressive-minded diaspora quite willing to press extreme views. My own, rather idiosyncratic view of justice is to favor the small and the weak against the large and the mighty. Greece does not, at this point, need me to state its case. I want to come back to another point that I introduced earlier. Salonica Terminus is about Greece, Albania, Kosovo, and Macedonia. But I also wanted it to be a book about us here in Canada, a mirror which, if it is held up in front of our own faces, allow us to see our own image. My travels in the southern Balkans reveal to me the human intensity of the quest for identity and the way in which identity can be reinforced, undermined, or manipulated by the powerful by differentiating between us and them, or when it suits them, effacing or erasing vital differences via assimilation, for instance. And more important, how the sense of identity, the sense of who we are, remains the last resort of the powerless. I'll go further. The prevailing dogma of the day, along with its corollary, the apparent God-given laws of the marketplace, tell us that the world is becoming a homogenized place, that human differences are vanishing along with national borders, that such things as the sense of who we are picturesque, quaint, even potentially violent and dangerous, as demonstrated by the disaster of Bosnia and the horror of Rwanda. You know the argument. It's on the editorial pages of the Globe and Mail, on the evening news, in the mouths of the Canadian and American political establishment. God forfend, they say, that we act politically in our own interests as we perceive them. We might offend the foreign investors. An argument I heard a lot in Greece went like this. You know, we're all Europeans now. All this talk of identity and nationality belongs to the past. Let us move ahead into the bright cosmopolitan future, etc., etc. How convenient. Having spent 2 centuries or more constructing its own finely honed sense of national identity and expanding rather aggressively, the Greek state was now claiming that for its neighbors to call themselves what they wished was an anachronism. Why, it was even a threat. Macedonians, tough luck. You're just too late. What may have been legitimate 80 or 50 years ago, just to pick a couple of dates that should resonate in the mind of any Macedonian, now belongs to a mythical past which must not be too closely examined. When we did it, goes the argument in Greece, it was right and heroic. But don't you try that. That was the message. It still is the message. And another reason why, when we discuss these matters, we should be fair, but not slip into the swamp of terminal relativism, not confuse what has happened and what is happening with what eventually, given the right mix of circumstances, might happen. These days, people in Quebec are getting the same message, or a similar one, from English Canada, or more properly, from the Canadian federal government. Quebecers are held to be nationalistic, which is now seen as a negative quality. They are, it is claimed, narrow-minded bigots who want to speak their own language and administer what they consider as their national territory with a greater degree of autonomy, preserve their language, maybe even set up their own country. In fact, they sound a lot like Macedonians, if you ask me. Canadian history is a funny thing. After losing the battle on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City, France gave up its North American possessions and delivered the French-speaking people living there over to Great Britain. For several years, it was generally accepted that those who had remained were a non-people, a people without a history, a people without a language. Didn't they speak a curious dialect, a kind of crude patois? Weren't they in the grip of the church, their every waking moment ruled by priests? Put bluntly, Quebec did not exist. Now it does, as most people have realized, particularly after the referendum of October 1995. But that hasn't stopped the federal government from attempting to persuade English-speaking Canadians that the aspirations of French-speaking Quebecers are retrograde, dangerous, and illegitimate, and trying now to convince English-speaking Quebecers that in the event Quebec becomes a sovereign country, their little municipalities should promptly declare secession. In fact, things are so tense, to give you an idea, that my wife informed me a couple of days ago that if I vote to join Quebec, our front room will remain a part of Canada. We haven't negotiated the bookshelf. When I heard the same kind of argument regarding Macedonia coming from Greeks who should have known better, it struck me that we had a pattern in which nationalism is the cardinal sin of the weak and the tiny, and the cleverly concealed, blunt-edged weapon of the arrogant and the mighty. We could surely argue that Greece belittles Macedonia's claim to establish its nationhood, the better to conceal its own sense of national superiority, its own intolerance. I'm saying to myself, isn't the Canadian federal government flirting with doing the same thing with regard to us in Quebec? Of course, we mustn't seek mechanical parallels where none exist. I raise this issue not in an attempt to prove that Quebec is Macedonia or vice versa, not at all. They cannot be compared, and we should state that clearly. The point I want to make is that the argument against nationalism is in fact wielded by the nationalists of larger countries, who not only never openly admit their names, but hide them. In fact, they are the masters of deceit and concealment. Their strategy is to make the small feel ridiculous, to humiliate and mock them and their aspirations, to treat them as if they do not exist, to assimilate them. My guess is that no one understands this ploy and sees through it better than Macedonians. A lady I met in Krushevo, a Vlach lady by the way, told me that the Macedonians have a saying, history is a whore. And I can appreciate that metaphor, which rings especially true in the Balkans, where poor Madame History must accommodate the same line of rough, brutish clients every night, each clamoring that its version is the only truth. But every profession must have a solid core of integrity. So it is too with history. It's possible to affirm, for instance, that certain events did occur, that their outcome is known, even though the precise motivation of the instigators of these events may be forever lost to us, and their future impact impossible to predict. For instance, in October of 1903, Macedonian rebels rose up against the Ottoman Empire, hoping for great power intervention to guarantee autonomy for which was then the last Ottoman province in Europe. 5 years later, in July 1908, the Young Turks proclaimed the Ottoman Constitution in Liberty Square in Salonica. In 1912, Greece invaded and seized much of Ottoman Macedonia, dividing up the rest with Serbia and Bulgaria. In 1948-49, when the Greek Civil War ended in bitter defeat for the communist-led revolutionary forces, many Macedonians were forced to leave their homes and lands, perhaps most of them forever. And this is just a small sampling of dates. There may be disagreement in the interpretation of what really happened. There can be no doubt that certain things were done, certain things were said, certain situations created. And most important, the entire list I've gone through has one common denominator. Do I have to say it? Macedonia. One of the things I wanted to do in Salonica Terminus was to show that the prevailing interpretation of these events in Greece was an integral part of an enterprise of identity construction. But it is exactly this right to undertake its own enterprise of identity construction that Greece has since denied Macedonia, arguing that Macedonians may one day commit the sins that Greece has already committed. The title of my book's first chapter is City of Shadows. The longer I stayed in Salonica, the more the whole structure of the city, its whole psychology, seemed committed to concealing or obscuring the past. Its city plan, drawn up after the Great Fire by a Frenchman named Ernest Hébrard, who later designed Imperial Hanoi, is a magnificent exercise in precisely this process of concealment, creating an ersatz Byzantine city where once a thriving Jewish, Turkish, Greek, Bulgarian, Macedonian, Albanian, Vlach, Armenian city existed. The looting of the city's Jewish cemetery during the occupation was another curious and tragic manifestation of this all-too-genuine repressed memory syndrome. When the tens of thousands of tombstones had been uprooted, the hallowed ground of a once proud community desecrated. The marble was promptly recycled, becoming parts of people's front yards, of downtown sidewalks, of the inside of St. Demetrius Basilica. To speak of Salonica, in fact, is to speak of the wider postmodern condition, of the attack on memory and on history, and of their willful concealment by the present. That's us. Now let us turn our attention to northern Greece, which the Greeks today call Macedonia, and which Macedonians, most Macedonians, I think, call Aegean Macedonia. As if to remind us that in our day the geographical entity known as Macedonia corresponded and corresponds with the Ottoman province that bore that name, Macedonia. This region is a land where one reality has been obscured by another, where one map has been overlaid by another, where place names have been changed to conceal, not to reveal. A new past had to be invented to conceal a truer past. A false pedigree had to be created to replace a genuine one. An ancient founding myth had to be revised to accommodate the appetite for land and for power. The idea was as brilliant as it was simple. Modern Greece is an unbroken continuum of civilization and culture, from Homer through Alexander down to the present. There are several conceptual problems with this myth. Maybe I'm understating. Perhaps the largest is the hiatus of nearly 5 centuries between 1430 and 1912, 1430 being the fall of Salonica, 1912 being the quote liberation unquote of Aegean Macedonia. Who lived in this region? Whence did they come? What language did they speak? Which god did they worship, and in what manner? I still remember my trip from Salonika to Evesa, or from Solun to Vodun, if you will, one cold December morning. My compartment mate was what they call a dopios in Greek, a local, a native. We struck up a conversation. It wasn't long before he began pointing out landmarks and villages to me, giving me their names in Macedonian. Aha, I said to myself. There was more than one way to look at this landscape. That was my introduction to the tragic and tragically suppressed story of Greece's Slav-speaking population, the Macedonians. As I visited the misty hills and valleys of the hinterland, I began to understand why there is so much bitterness and heartache, and why these feelings are unlikely to vanish. It became clear that for Greece, the really contentious issue was less the government in Skopje or the Macedonian flag, and much more the status of its own Slav-speaking minority, the Macedonians. In fact, even to say this aloud and in public in Greece challenges the country's official description of itself as the most homogeneous country in the Balkans. Not only that, it challenges the prevailing view among the country's academics and journalists that minorities, especially national or linguistic minorities, do not exist. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, no self-respecting journalist is going to believe such a thing. A Balkan country with no minorities. You've got to be kidding. So one cold evening in Florina, Lerin, I put my hunch to the test. I called a telephone number I'd been given by friends in Salonika and left a message for a man called Kostas Gotsis. Early the next morning, the phone in my hotel room rang. It was Mr. Gotsis himself. 1/2 hour later, we were driving up country toward his native village, a place called Buf. If my information is correct, this is also the birthplace of a large number of Toronto Macedonians. Mr. Gotsis, who I was devastated to learn last fall has subsequently died, drove me then to the village. All around us were the skeletons of houses, a dilapidated schoolhouse, a rundown public square. If it had not been for a handful of people straggling across the main street, Buf could just as well have been a ghost town. We attempted to engage people in conversation, but no one was prepared to do so in public. Concerned that the security police might arrive at any moment, we left. On the way back, my host told me how his father, who was killed in action in 1948 in the Greek Civil War, was later sentenced to death posthumously. Kill him twice. What I saw and heard in Buf that day was bitter testimony, both to the cruelty of the sufferings of the Macedonians and to the failure of Greece's policy of denial. For the awareness among Macedonians of the particulars of their history is still alive, paradoxically perhaps more than 10 or 15 years ago. But I want to repeat, I haven't come here this afternoon to condemn Greek policy, Greece or the Greeks. Who am I to be condemning anybody, least of all a country and its people? On whose authority and at whose behest? I don't intend to substitute my own imperfect understanding of what happened in a remote place many years ago for the true life experiences of those who endured it or wrought it, as the case may be. In fact, I would even argue to you that state policy, which engendered a long history of national superiority, transformed decent men and women into uncritical, perhaps even willing perpetrators of an injustice. Just as the dark side of this same history transformed generations of Macedonians into outlaws in their own land, into exiles, and into non-persons. Still, I insist, today's talk is not a criticism of Greece, but part of an ongoing effort to understand why that country acted as it did, and continues to do. My thesis is that instead of pointing the finger at Greece or at the Greeks, we should instead point the finger to a greater guilty party, the extremist, narrow-minded nationalism that arose in Europe after and from the Enlightenment, our cultural heritage. The very nationalism that lies still at the heart of what Europe is and claims to be. And that is alive, very much alive, in the strangest places today. In one sense, the aim of this powerful ideology was to consolidate the national state as a unified market. In another sense, it could be used as a catalyst to break down other models of social organization, such as the Ottoman Empire, where citizenship was religious, not national, or to attack, divide, and subjugate non-Western cultures, such as the Islamic world as a whole. Early on, the founders of the modern Greek state seized on the European model. The new Greek state was to be exclusionist, expansionist, aggressively and resolutely Western. Did this kind of social organization suit the mentality of the people who then populated the southern Balkans? My guess is that it did not. Does the new global order currently on offer suit their mentality or their human needs any better? If we define the transition from the collapsed socialist system on the one hand to triumphant capitalism as the rapid process of pauperization for the many and riches for the few, then it can be confidently predicted to fail as well. Not only that, in the name of competition, it will generate new and perhaps bloodier conflicts. But enough of predictions. Let's ask more questions. So why did I write Salonica Terminus? To set the record straight? Partially. To take up the cause of the underdog, the victims of injustice? Definitely. To sound the alarm about the potential for conflict, even war, in the lands known as Macedonia? Most certainly. But I had one overwhelming reason. I wanted to underline the importance of history. That's why I'm very glad that a historical society invited me to come and speak. For the need to understand the past if we are to understand who we are, why we act as we do. James Joyce, an Irishman who knew of what he spoke, said, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." I don't want to second-guess Mr. Joyce, one of our century's greatest creative spirits, but I do not believe that we should awaken from our nightmare. We need history too much, especially today. The new forces that are reshaping the world, scouring out the past like some powerful abrasive, are telling us that we must live only in the present and fear any future that they have not defined for us, that we must adapt infinitely, that each of us must become a tabula rasa, a blank sheet of paper upon which anything can be written. You'll pardon me if I label their enterprise as inhuman, destructive of society, and fraught with potential horror. I don't think I'm alone in holding that view. One thing that touches and moves me about Macedonia is precisely the power of memory against denial, the strength of the past as it reaches into the present to assert its rights. There's more. Every attempt to deny, to obliterate the past, to change the names of places and things, destroys not only the victim, of course, but the perpetrator. If Greek society cannot come to terms with its denial of Macedonian existence, something for which generations of Macedonians have paid a heavy price, then its failure to do so will come back to haunt it. This may be happening today. But the behavior of the Greek state is a symptom, not a cause. And in that sense, it too is a warning to us. Exclusionary, aggressive nationalism is an evil in which the Balkans are still embroiled. The emerging New World Order, in which memory and identity are bleached from the fabric of existence, is a still greater evil. Its ultimate aim is not the reconciliation and celebration of difference, but its elimination. Instead of the identity which is our birthright and that of our children, we shall have, quote, choice, unquote, like in some vast world supermarket, except that the choice offered is no choice at all, for the products all look and smell and taste exactly the same. Let me confess, in concluding, that I found much to admire among the Macedonians. Their stubbornness, their refusal to bow down in the face of overwhelming force, their dogged insistence on the right to define themselves, to proclaim to the face of the world, we exist. I see many of those same virtues among the Quebecois. In both cases, our masters may or may not like it, but we will not perform them the service they seek above all others, to fade away, to disappear. No, we're here to stay. Thank you.
I would like to thank our speaker. And
Fire away.
This paints a pretty clear picture of the almost unanimous and universal opposition to Macedonia on the part of the Greek population. Is it that emphatic? I mean, are there no elements of reason within a country of 8 million odd people where either politically or informally that there's a recognition that something is wrong? Is it that bleak?
I think if you take the official position, that which is reflected in the media, and which the government would like to make us believe is unanimously held, I would say it is bleak. I think that if you approach Greeks as you should approach any group of human beings,
as people capable of listening to a reasoned argument, then I would say no, it isn't. So although I paint a relatively bleak portrait of the official Greek grasp of the Macedonian dilemma, I believe that Greeks, like anyone else, are permeable to having the case argued reasonably. I'm going to go there in about 6 weeks and see how far I get doing it. Thanks. I'll need it. But the short, that's the long answer. The short answer is I believe yes, that there are small groups of people, some human rights groups and some courageous individuals who have taken a public position, saying in fact that the Greek case is founded on falsehood. That takes some daring. But there are such people. Yes, sir.
You seem to suggest in Salonica Terminus that Macedonia is possibly the next Sarajevo, the Bosnian kind of thing. What do you see that as the basis? You see armed conflict coming there?
One has to be careful with predictions, and you have to beware of journalists who are predicting doom, because you could say they're trying to create a job for themselves tomorrow. You know. So I want to be very cautious about that, but I think we'd be mistaken not to see the potential for danger there. In this book, I relate the incident where I visited Mr. Papandreou's office in Athens. And although I didn't speak to the great man, I spoke to one of his secretaries, who showed me a map of a little rectangular-shaped country, which was divided into 4. And I said, well, is that the Greek government position? He didn't say yes or no, he just smiled. I know there was a plan to split up Macedonia. In fact, there may have been several plans, but there was a plan which was foiled amongst Albania, Bulgaria, so-called New Yugoslavia, and Greece. I don't imagine the plan has disappeared. I imagine it still exists in exactly what form, how it would be activated. I haven't the faintest idea. So it's not possible to distinguish the contours of the future. And it would be dangerous to make any prediction at all. But I think it would be foolish not to say that there are mischievous hands at work in the Balkans, that the situation is unstable, highly unstable, and that were there to be a conflict, an armed conflict in Macedonia, it would be worse than Bosnia, because there would be immediate involvement of powerful outside forces, particularly Greece and Turkey. Both of, well, the Turks, I believe, would feel that they had an interest. And I'm aware that the Macedonian government cultivates that they have cordial relations with Ankara in that regard, for instance. But one could see how a thing like that could get out of hand. I'm not saying it's going to happen, and where's there wood that I can touch that it not.
There was another question just in the audience. Question?
Are you going to field the question?
Well, I'm just trying to see that everybody...
Yeah, okay, you do it and I'll answer. Yeah. I can drink some water now.
Okay. I see striking parallels between the problems in Canada and the problems in Greece, but I feel you're right saying that it comes from a nationalist sort of state perspective, but I think all of this boils down to economics. What the Greeks have done to us is based on economics, and I think in Ontario or the rest of Canada, we're worried about Quebec seceding, not because we care about the Quebecois or the Quebecers personally. We're worried what will it do to us economically and our standard of living. And I think in the Greek state, that's the same problem. If they allow us to secede, what sort of economic impact will we suffer if we go? It's a very fertile region, as you know.
Yes. Although, if you travel in some Macedonian villages, you'd have to say that's pretty rocky country. I don't know how fertile was Bouf. I mean, obviously it was a prosperous town at one time. And clearly in the region at the foot of the mountains, there are intensely fertile fields, but the village itself is mostly rocks. I myself, I'm not moved by the economic argument, and I don't like to hide behind the dollar sign. I don't believe in economic determinism. I don't believe that it is in fact only economy which drives our existence. I mean, I hope I'm right. If we are nothing but economic beings, then what the hell's the point of talking about anything? Just line up with your cash, you know. So I'd say, sure, that's a consideration. But is it the only consideration? I don't believe it is. I tried to suggest in the book that I believe that the history of European culture as defined by the Enlightenment has that bias. And one of the things that the masters of our world today want to somehow drum into our heads is that the only dimension of our being is the economic one. And for that reason alone, I think we should say, no, it's not. Only for that reason, if nothing else.
Sorry, when the question is being put through, can you please repeat it so that we can have it?
I'm sorry.
Because
Yeah.
we are videotaping the lecture.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of questions rolled in one if I can. What you were saying about the triangle, whatever, Papandreou, you were mentioning.
Yes, yes.
If they're talking about taking over Macedonia or whatever, why are I've been reading the papers that there's American soldiers on the border with Serbia. Are they worried about Serbia coming in, or are they worried more about the Greeks coming in, or who?
The question was, let me make sure I'm restating this correctly. What is the concern about the possible partition of Macedonia? Is it that of Serbs moving south? And you had asked about the presence of American troops there. At the border, yes. The previously non-existent border, but now the existing national border between Macedonia and Serbia. Actually, it's Kosovo, which could become Albanian any day now, or any year now. But I don't know the answer to that. If I knew what Washington was thinking, I would guess I would be in Washington. I can only estimate what they're thinking, but some people in the Balkans say that everything is being controlled by Washington. I would say that Washington would like to have that idea and would like to have people believing that. But I'm thinking back to the history of the region where outside powers have always played a strong role, and in some cases a predominant role. And in the case of the Germans, of course, they conquered it, but they didn't last long. Of course, the Yanks are much more subtle, and I'm not trying to equate them with the Germans either, but there's also a local factor. There's the factor of history. There's the factor of who people are. Is there a greater Albania in the making? Will there be a new profile for Albania in the next decade? My guess is that there will be, for instance. Have the Bulgarians ever given up on the notion that really they're Macedonia? What is deepest in their hearts?
Would you not say that what's happened in Bosnia over the last 4 or 5 years, whatever, would stop anything happening to Macedonia because of that?
Would what happened in Bosnia stop anything from happening similar in Macedonia?
Yeah, because it's so close in proximity and so on.
I don't see why that would stop anybody. Especially if the parties that came out on top in the Bosnian dispute, if people with a similar outlook to theirs say, aha, if we do it this way, we can win. Because clearly people came out on top on that. The Bosnian state is nothing but a shadow of what it should have been or would have been. It's now a federation. And who here believes that that's going to last any longer than the flickering of a historical eyelash? Let's be serious. That's permit me to be cynical.
You mentioned about going to Greece. The purpose of your trip, is that perhaps you know, predicated on a sequel? And how would you see a sequel as far as this book is concerned? Like, where else could it go from this point?
The question was asked that I'm talking about going to Greece shortly, and am I contemplating a sequel of Salonica Terminus? The long answer is that I have an invitation to speak in Skopje about this book, and so I'm going to respond to that invitation, if possible, and also in Tirana, in Albania. But I want to go to Greece also and hopefully speak in public on this subject and just see if I can do it. I want to see if I can enter the country, first of all, unless I have an Acheron stamped on my visa. But I say to my friends in Greece, look, you're a modern European country, and there's freedom of opinion in your country. Yes? Yes. Well, but if not, then there will be an unholy stink. And as for a sequel, I don't contemplate it. If somewhere along the line it becomes obvious that it has to be done, then I will examine it. I have other projects now.
Do you think it's inevitable that Greece is going to bow to international groups like the EU or NATO and start recognizing minority rights?
Do I think that Greece will eventually bow to the inevitable, did you say?
I think so.
And recognize the Macedonians? I suggested that in my talk, that I think that is the only course for Greece to take. Do countries bow to the will of international bodies so far? In economic terms, they do. But they found an interesting way to somehow disconnect the economic considerations, which somehow gets back to our earlier question, from the political. That's one of the bizarre things about the EU and about other world bodies, that the economic hand, the right hand, doesn't often know what the political hand, the left hand, is doing. Are they the same? I don't think that they are. I think that there is a distinction there. But my feeling is that it should and it must. Now, do those two factors mean that it will? I'd like to say yes. I hope so. I hope that there's the possibility that Greece will become something else than what it was. This process took place in Germany after, if I can just continue a little bit, after the collapse of the Nazis. Of course, I don't want to compare Greece and Nazi Germany, not at all. But nonetheless, there was a dark past that had to be grappled with. And there are shadows in Greece's past, which, if brought to the surface and examined in the light of day, would help everyone. If there is injustice, and if you built your present existence on injustice, then you want to come to grips with that. Maybe you can't change it, but you can acknowledge it. Maybe that would be the thing. If somehow someone could say to the Macedonians in their own language, we did this too and we acknowledge it, and now you're free citizens to speak your language, to have schools, etc., etc. Well, that would be somehow a step, wouldn't it? Huh? But I'd say the same thing to Greece. If I'm speaking in Athens to a Greek audience, I'd say, wouldn't that be a reasonable thing to do? But then, who am I?
There's just something over there. Would you like to ask a question?
How many languages has your book been published in?
I believe there will be a Farsi edition in Tehran. I think there will be a Macedonian edition. I hear the rumors of that, and I'm almost sure there'll be an Albanian edition. Although it cannot be ruled out. I think somewhere along the line, some Greek publisher is going to say, aha, this is controversial, therefore it'll sell. So, to get back to the economic argument, which I like to knock the economic argument, but still, let's be realistic here. If a Greek publisher figures it can sell, a couple of thousand of these babies, because it's going to stir up a hornet's nest of complaints, then maybe they'll do it. Otherwise, there is a secret police apparatus in Greece that says to publishers, you can't publish this book.
Mr. Reed, my question is in regards to the
Salonica being designated as the cultural capital of Europe this year, 97. Do you feel that meeting the intellectuals and writers in Greece, do you feel that they're going to tackle this issue of the oppressive measures that took place in the past? Culture and intellectual sort of thing to inform their own public or not?
The question was, Salonica is the cultural capital of Europe for the year 1997. Will the Greek authorities grasp this occasion to examine their past in a way that they have not done before? Is that a fair restatement of the question? My own feeling as a friend of Greece is that they should. My gut feeling, knowing who's organizing this event and in what way, is that they won't. Although I do know that they are spending a week of the 52 weeks available to them as the cultural capital specifically on the Jewish community. And I'm sure that they will hold seminars and public meetings and public lectures in which the details of the destruction of the Jews of Salonika will be discussed. Of this I'm sure of. This is spoken of in limited circles in Salonika already. I participated in several such gatherings when I was there myself. But it hasn't come through yet to the level of the general public and the public perception. As for the M word, I wouldn't predict that that's going to be uttered publicly the way that you mean it. And I might add the way I mean it, yes.
Everybody knows about United Europe. The Greeks are very active on it. And they recognize the human rights. They like to speak singing in Greek, in abroad, in Germany, in French, in Belgium.
In Macedonia.
But
in Toronto.
How come, and they sign probably the things, and they agree to be free, and doesn't let into Macedonian or Slavic or Dopia, what they call, singing over their own songs? How you can express that to, or ask that question? How come he's contradicting one with another?
Our question is that there appears to be a contradiction in Greece's espousing of the principles of the European Union and those of free speech, which are generally accepted in civilized societies around the world, with its refusal to let Macedonians, for instance, sing songs in their language. And I have no answer for that except to say, well, voila, there is in fact a contradiction. A hell of a big contradiction, in fact. And I would love to, were I speaking to a Greek audience, raise that question. Why not? Will the uttering of words in Macedonian somehow cause the Greek state to collapse? If so, then these are truly dangerous people. No suppression is violent enough for them. They must be clearly eradicated. But maybe that's the idea. Maybe there's a secret here that we don't know. I think the gentleman in the back.
Mr. Reed, did you visit the islands at all? And did you find there was a distinct difference in the attitude of the people on the islands as against those in the mainland in general towards the foreign element that we're talking about, whatever it may be?
Did I detect a difference in the attitude of Greeks on islands as opposed to those in the mainland? No, not really. Quite frankly, if you're a foreigner and you go to a Greek island, what they're really interested in is getting a hotel room for you, giving you a Greek salad, a quote-unquote Greek salad, you know, the kind with tomatoes and feta and so on. I know. That's why I'm giving you the chance to respond to that. So the main priority is not what do you think about the Macedonian question, quite frankly.
You mentioned Loring Danforth's book on the Macedonians, and he talks about a Macedonian diaspora. And I thought he gave it very well and balanced viewpoint between the Greek Macedonian viewpoint and the Macedonian viewpoint. Did you find, if you would compare, say, what you viewed from your journeys in Macedonia, would you say that the Macedonians are cowed, that they're afraid to speak out? I mean, we can speak here in a democratic country, we feel perfectly safe, otherwise we have the paranoia of ever returning to Greece. Of course, that would bother us. but what did you find? How did you feel? What was your sense of what these non-existent people were saying to you? They always seemed to, you shrouded it from your book, you shrouded it in secrecy. You had to have this phone call, you had to have this meeting place, you had this fear of the police eavesdropping on them.
The question was, do the Macedonians of northern Greece feel cowed by the situation they find themselves in, as opposed to the total freedom with which we can speak about the issue here in this public library in Toronto? My answer is yes, I found that. And I wrote the book the way I wrote it because I sensed precisely that. If I go to a town with somebody, and this is in Greece, a country that I know very well, generally if you go to a village in that country, especially a remote one, people will still say, come on, sit down, have a coffee, where did you come from, and so on. And there's some interest, not hostility and almost fear. Who might be the stranger in our midst? Maybe he's a cop. Or if he's a foreigner, what bad news can he possibly be bringing? What do they want now? I met people who I later understood clearly were Macedonians, but who were not prepared to admit that, and who were clearly ashamed at speaking bad Greek, when maybe they should have been happy to speak very well their native language. So my answer is yes, and I found that shocking.
I particularly found your book interesting for its historical value for the background of Salonica. And especially at the beginning of the book, you mention all the different languages that were spoken in Salonica. But nowhere in the beginning did you mention that there was any Macedonian at all. And I thought that was, as was the capital of Macedonia, that there should be some Macedonians that were speaking it. If you could answer.
Well, the question was, why didn't I mention that people at some point spoke Macedonian in Thessaloniki? And this in fact is a this is a kind of a tricky question. What are we talking about? That's a city that's been there for 2,100 years. When? Early, middle, or late? If we're talking about under the, of course, Thessaloniki was created after the death of Alexander. Are we talking about then? Then it would seem obvious that Macedonian would have been one of the languages spoken there, although I think Greek would also have been spoken. If we're talking about Byzantine times, leaping over the Roman era, when I'm sure those languages were, some variant of those languages was then being spoken, and come into Byzantine times, I'm not a linguist and I don't want to get involved in a debate over historical linguistics, which is one of the favorite preserves of national demagogues, by the way. Everybody will say, I've got the alphabet, which demonstrates that we were, etc., etc. And maybe it's true, but maybe it isn't. And sometimes these things have been demonstrated to be fakes or so influenced by one's feelings as not to have scientific validity. But then what's scientific validity? So we can go on and on like that. But let's talk about recent times, the last 200 years, say, or Ottoman times. Some Greeks I spoke to who had memories of growing up in old Salonica, or heard from their parents what it was like, said, oh, sure, there were Macedonians. Makedonskos, we called them. And they spoke their own language. And you can find, I found this out later after I'd written the book, which is why it's not in there. But there's a lot that's not in this book. I mean, what is left out is 10 times more than what is in there. And I wanted that book to be that way, as if its content had been forced through a funnel into it. I wanted it to be concentrated, not dilute. And you can encounter in the first editions of some modern Greek novels references to Macedonians, which were later taken out after the end of the Greek Civil War. There's a famous book by Sartis Mirivilis called Life in the Tomb, Izoia and Dafo, which is a book about the First World War, about the Macedonian front, in which the narrator of the book, who is a Greek, meets Macedonians. And he asks, who are you? And they say, well, we're Macedonian Orthodox. Exactly that. We're not Bulgarians or anything else. We're that. This is in a well-known work of modern Greek literature. So there are clearly signs that if that language wasn't spoken in Thessaloniki, it was surely spoken around the city. But you know, well, if I write a sequel, I'll put that in, yeah.
We'll hold you to it.
I'm sure you will, inescapably.
I studied in Thessaloniki, and
during my time there were two newspapers in Thessaloniki. Main was crossroads, which mainly represented the view of the state, and Macedonia.
Yes.
And the police was after people who were buying Macedonia. At the same time, the Ministry of Macedonia today was called
That's right.
No such thing as Macedonia. Suddenly the Greeks now changed. They made Epureo Macedonias, they made Macedonia and everything Macedonia. And my opinion, this book will be a very enlightening to the Greek people, because I think Greece right now, it's living, and the Greek people are living covered under a dark umbrella, which is guided by the church and by the police and by the army, and they have no opportunity to develop themselves. And not only the Macedonians, they subjugated down, they took everything from us, they didn't give us any job, any opportunity to study. So we didn't have any educated people to represent us in Greece. But even the Greek people, I think, they still live in a very, very dark age. And they don't know where they belong, they don't know where they are. And for me, I think it would be very advisable the Greeks to translate this book, because I think the first time it gives them some kind of light after this dark period from the time they established the ethnic society.
I can't restate the question because the question was, shouldn't the Greeks translate this book? And of course they should. It's obvious. Why aren't they doing it? So what I would like you to do is to find me a Greek publisher who will undertake this. And no, I don't mean to be flippant with you.
Because they lose a lot of brain from Greece. I mean, when I was in Greece, the most educated people, doctors, lawyers, everything, I went to the army and they were put to shovel. And the people who didn't know anything, they were put to become officers. So could you imagine a state living these circumstances, how they are going to progress themselves?
Well, they even took over the country.
I found your talk really fascinating because I too, being born here in Toronto as a Canadian of Macedonian extraction, and traveled in Macedonia, Greece, and Turkey in the 60s and the 70s. What amazed me also was that in Turkey, when I went to the bazaar, I could get by with Macedonian. And having talked to some of the storekeepers who lived there, they said that they were Muslims who were from Macedonia who were sent out of the country when Tito came into power. So I mean, to me it was very fascinating that I was able to get by being able to speak Macedonian with people who had lived, they claimed, 500 years in Macedonia, and they were asked to leave too.
I can't transmit that either because that's a statement of what happened. I can respond to that by saying that I visited a small village near Evelik, which is across the straits from Mytilene in Turkey. And I encountered there some elderly gentlemen who were speaking in Cretan dialect. They were from Rethymno in Crete. And it was difficult to understand them, but they were clearly speaking a Greek dialect of Greek with a ch, you know, as they speak in Crete. And they were very nostalgic for their old homeland. They said, we don't fit in here. We speak Turkish, but we're Cretan. The only difference is that they were Muslims. Quite precisely that. They had always lived there. That was their place. But when the change of populations came, of course, it didn't come. There was a reason for that. Albanians tell you exactly the same story. Turkey is a mosaic of, among other things, ex-Balkan peoples.
What reaction have you had from the Greek community in Toronto over this book?
What reaction have I had from the Greek community in Toronto? Well, I don't live here, so I can't measure their reaction.
Not heard of any reaction?
But my publisher attempted to contact Greek community organizations, Greek media, and so on, so that I'd have the opportunity to speak with them and to field questions, even hostile questions. I don't care. I'm prepared to answer any questions on this in Greek. And no one would take it up at all. And in fact, they expressed some hostility. They said, we won't talk to that guy whatsoever. He's an enemy of Greece, and if he ever goes to Greece, the hell with him. Let him kick him out. You know. Roughly at that level. But there has been a slight breakthrough. I believe that shortly, in one of the Greek newspapers, there will be Greek language excerpts from this book appearing. And I translated them myself. And we have to pay to publish them, but we're going to do it. Because I want to put the content of this book in front of Greek-speaking people so that they can judge for themselves. If you don't like it, well, that's okay, but give us a shot, you know. Yes.
I have two questions.
Short questions.
You introduce yourself as a Greek or as a Canadian? Why?
When I'm in Greece, what do I introduce myself as? Yes. No, I say I'm a Quebequesos. I'm a Quebecer. Yeah.
I have the book, and over there you are very well speaking in Greece, Greek language, and all those things. To the people over there, you say, I am Quebecois or from Canada,
yeah.
or I am Greek. One question, yes, always in my life, I'm old now, the Greek...
That makes two of us, yeah.
When the war starts with Albania or Italians say, came the priest over there say, soldiers, my boys, the God with us, go. One was, that was, always the God is belong to Greek people. And they always have complaints about, I don't know why, maybe they wake very late and speaking Albania, North Epirus belong to Greece, Macedonia belong to Greece, Bulgaria is Sofia, that is Greece, capital. And all those things, maybe they start later or that is from the ages, that's the same.
I can't summarize these questions either, except because these aren't really questions. This is a statement in the disguised as a question. But I have no Greek descent at all. I'm not a Greek person at all. I just happen to know that language. So if people ask me what I am, I say I'm exactly that. I speak this language. Forgive me for my mistakes, but this is it, and it's as simple as that. As for God being Greek, well, I remember during the Vietnam War. This shows you what my background is and sort of where I come from. That the Roman Catholic Cardinal of New York stood on the deck of an American aircraft carrier off the shore of that unfortunate country and blessed the airplanes as they were flying off to bomb the Vietnamese. Clearly God was an American. He may still be, actually.
I just wanted to mention that we were in Greece, we were in Salonica. We were in where the bazaar was. I forgot where they were selling food and what have you. We didn't speak Greek. We don't speak Greek. We only spoken English and Macedonian. We happened to be going down a little aisle. And when we were going down the little aisle, we were speaking in Macedonian, my wife and I. And this shopkeeper, I mentioned, I looked in the window and I said, look at that beautiful pizza over there. And the shopkeeper, eyes lit up, he turned around. He said, oh, a Turkish pizza in Macedonia. He said, come on in. We went into the shop, and he said, you don't want that pizza over there. I've got some fresh in the oven. Out of the oven, and he treated us to the pizza, didn't even charge us. We asked him whether he was Macedonian. He said, no, he was Turkish, but he was there from the time back when everybody spoke Macedonian. I thought you'd like to hear that.
I do.
Are you intending to learn any Macedonian before you go back to Salonica?
Well, no, in 6 weeks I intend to totally master this language, yeah. That's my way of saying, unfortunately, no. But I used to speak a little bit of Russian, so I have, you know, a certain familiarity with the way Slavic languages operate. Yeah, well. Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
I would like to make a small addition regarding the lady mentioned something that if a Macedonian spoke in Salonica, I know about old days, but I know recent days after the collapse of Junta, 76, 77, they start campaigning, you know, to attract tourism from Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia at that time. So all over the tourist bureaus, you know, they'll say, Zetunde, Kiri, Namilun, Slavica.
Says Kerlevenopolita.
There came, it so happened, Nargasluta Taxperia Practorium Xenologia, meaning, you know, to get jobs as to be employed in hotels or travel industry. Anyway, so it so happened that a couple just returned from Tashkent of Ponti origin.
Yes.
They spoke perfect Russian. So they went to apply for the job. So the question was, what kind of Slav do you speak? Russian or Hebrew? Tadopia.
Perfect. Tadopia is Macedonski. Yeah, yeah.
They were confusing the Russian.
You always compared the analogy of Quebec in Canada to Macedonia and Greece. Would you not rather do Tibet and China because of the oppression? Here where at least Quebec is in a democracy, Greece supposedly is the cradle of democracy, and yet they're treating them like Tibet. Would you not agree to that?
I wouldn't reject that, or the case of the Palestinians in Israel. I don't want to, I'm not arguing for a parallel or a direct comparison with these cases. What interests me is the way this mechanism works, as to how the dominant power somehow makes the dominated smaller group feel the way it feels about itself. That's the thing I wanted to get at. And that feeling is strong in Quebec. It's not the same, and it cannot be the same, because history is different.
Yeah, but when Quebec ever goes, even Chrétien, our prime minister, our leader, says they'll go democratically. You can't see that happening in Greece at all. In fact, they'll never let it go. But at least let them speak their own language is what they want. I mean, that's security.
Who could disagree?
I don't know, the Greeks apparently.
Well, apparently, yeah. But no, if you're asking for my reaction, and I can't represent Greece, and I refuse to do it. Just like I can't represent Macedonians. All I can represent is myself and my own view of what my society feels. Which is why I raised that issue, and it surely is my opinion. Don't take it as anything else. I don't have a direct line to, you know, to the creator in these matters, and who does, right? Oh, you do, eh? I'll check with you later. Let me give you my card.
I'll just add to what the gentleman was saying, that I think that if we are going to make comparisons, then we should think in terms of, would Greece have a referendum? The Macedonian population in Greece to say who they are.
That's not even part of it. We can't compare the two things. Once again, what I'm comparing is the process of others defining us versus the way we define ourselves. That's all. That's all. I guess you could. I guess you could. I guess you could. And certain people in Quebec say, well, the Anglos are treating us essentially in that way, and historically they have. People do have that point of view. It's not my personal point of view. But nonetheless, that is also an argument that you hear. You might say it's an extreme argument.
But the Greeks reneged on the promises. That's the difference. If you're going to make a comparison, this is what I found when I read your book. You like to make the case for Quebec, and I don't disagree with you, but you've forgotten one of the item. The Greeks reneged on promises that were made to the Macedonians, whereas the Anglos did not. For instance, the Quebec Act of 1774 said the Quebecois, they were going to have these rights, and damn it, they have them. Those same kind of rights were promised to Macedonians, and the Greeks reneged on them. You shouldn't forget that subtle point.
Well, I'm not trying to forget or
That's a historical fact, though.
to cover over any subtleties or details. Like I said before, I'm not comparing similar cases.
No, but
Let's make that very clear.
I'm only responding to what you've written in your book.
Yes.
And I think it's an excellent book, and I think it needs to be read by the Greeks. But it seems to me you've forgotten that point. The promises were made to the Macedonians, and the Greeks reneged on them. And you make the case for Quebec and the Quebecois, and you're making us feel, as this gentleman said, you know, this is a democratic country that they have. My God, we Macedonians would be thrilled to have the kind of oppression that these poor Quebecois have.
Yeah.
We would die for it.
Well,
you know, I mean, don't lose that point, please. Don't
as the Muslims say, inshallah, that you should have this problem, you know. Yeah. Yeah, may God grant that you should have this problem, you know.
That's right.
No, I'll certainly endorse that.
Could that be heard on the tape or? Okay, all right.
I think that lady there had her hand up.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, sorry.
In the early 80s, we were, I think 1983, we were in Seoul. I refused to stay there for a mission. I'm a Canadian of Macedonian descent. I'm
Yes.
born here. And we, by chance, happened upon a museum in Seoul. It was a museum about Macedonians, and it was in a Jewish home that had been taken away from the Jews by the Greeks. They were turned in during the Second World War. It even said in the pamphlet, were turned in by the Greeks to the Germans. And this beautiful house was taken over and later made as a museum for Macedonians. And in this were rooms for Macedonian homes, costumes. We were put in that museum the way the Canadians and the Americans put the Indians. That this is how the Macedonians lived. This is how the Macedonians ate. And so now we show in the museum the wigwams with the teepees and the way the Indians lived. And it is in Solon. And I have, postcards at home. If you do go, I think it's in the Museum of Macedonian History. Please try and find it.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's a very interesting place. If you have to visit.
There is a place like that in Kostur, also. But the same phenomenon is at work. Yes. The folklorization, you know, of what is real and actual.
Yeah. And I think if people see that, they'll know how the Macedonians feel in Greece. And I'm not even born there, but I understand that, what our ancestors have told us.
Can I say something? Continue with that lady said how bloody for us the Greek in Greece. I was born in Florina, Macedonia. You know what they say? They call us Bulgarians. Bulgarians up to there, Bulgarians down to there. And now here in Canada, you know, I have friends, Greek friends, they say you're Greek. I says, how come here in Canada, where I find it, who I am, you want to make me now Greek? How come you didn't make me Greek in Greece when I wanted to be Greek? So I can suffer, you know? And then I want to say something else about the ladies. They used to say the Bulgarians, they have a big head. All us, the Slavish people, you know, we have big heads. We're stupid, we don't know nothing. And nothing to compare to the Greeks. The Greeks are a superior race. They came direct from the Asian Greeks, nothing to do with the Asian Greeks. Because they're all from Turkey, from Albania, from everywhere. And you know what else? It happens, I met Bulgarian guy, I never been to Bulgaria. Never. Till 87 when I was to Greece and was a tour, I went there. You know, I want to go to see because they always call me Bulgaria, you know? You know, so I went to see from where my ancestors come. So anyway, I went there to see. So I met, first time I met a Bulgarian guy here in Canada. I was waitressing in a restaurant. And this guy was nice and tall guy, you know, really nice, handsome guy. And I was serving him. And he didn't know so much English, you know, with a lot of Macedonian and the Bulgarian, you know, they're very close, you know, let's, you know, admit that. And, you know, we started communicating with the guy. One day I was going around him, you know, and he says, what doing? I said, how come you don't have a big head? Because the Greeks, the Bulgarians, they have a big head. The guy, he was laughing, he went down the floor. I said, you have a big head. Ask anybody who was born in Greece, he notified that. They call us, Bulgarians with big heads. My mother, what she used to say, I wish we had a, gypsy name and not this name. That law they put us. And another thing, my grandfather was a permanent, like a nobleman in Leri, that time, in the Turkish time. And they built the church, Saint Pandelemon in Leri, and they knew, the bishop in Leri, he put it down because he thought the walls are ready to fall. That's all was because the Macedonians built that church. And now he's having a new church, like a spectacular one, And my mother used to say, because my mother was a 9-year-old when the Greeks came, when the Turks left, she used to say, the Turkish, like the head of state who was representing the Turkey there in Florida, he used to come and talk with my grandfather. He said, all the Macedonians, the time they speak Turkish, and the Turkish, they speak Macedonian. The Greeks, they say the Turkish are barbarians. Even to this day, the barbarians, I hear the Greek radios and everything. You know what? My mother says the Turks are not barbarians. Because, 400 years in our 500 years, they don't stop the people talking their language. The Greeks, in 40 years, they did that.
To get a book called The Forgotten Father of the Computer, and it was written by, not written by, but in other words, it's portraying that the computer was invented by a man called Atanasov. I believe that's a man. What? Has anybody ever heard of that book? They've heard about it?
Yeah.
So don't let yourself down. The computer!
When you visited Booth and most of those villages that are ghost towns now, those ghost towns, they ended up being ghost towns due to the fact they bloodshed and they were run out of their towns. And most of us that were here were in the Republic of Macedonia because we couldn't live in Greece no longer by the torture, persecution, and everything else. Maybe we're here, and the people there in the Republic of Macedonia are in there. But the fact is, the ghosts are there, and our souls are there. Our ancestors are there in the villages. They're still there. Did you feel last Macedonian because it was empty? How did you feel when you went to this little towns, the little ghost towns? How was your feeling? Did you feel last Macedonia there was more Greece? What was it?
The tragedy of those towns, the way I saw it, and I visited another such town, in fact several, around the Prespes Lakes as well, which are also Macedonian. And the same phenomenon was visible. There were a few Greeks running the place, and they were probably in the Asphalia or in Keep, and there was no one else. And so you felt as if these places were somehow nowhere. That's what the feeling that you got was that they were somehow nowhere.
Those villages, there used to be thousands of people.
You could tell that these were once prosperous places. Yes.
Prosperous places.
Yeah.
And until today, the town that I come from, which is Ermenskov, apparently they get more strawberries. All the Germans, they come to pick up all the strawberries and all the fruit from this town. There was a very fertile land. The people didn't leave out of their choice. They were forced out of their town. And when they say that, the Greeks, they were lenient with some of these people, that's not so. The ghost towns, they're ghost towns today due to the fact out of oppression, pressure, and from the Greeks. That's why there is no
there. Nobody leaves their home for no reason at all. And even though we're all over the world, our soul is still there, walking.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, bottom of page 252 in your text.
What have I said now?
And you do an excellent job in showing how this can be manipulated. You have, in 1904, you have the census of 648,000 patriarchates, 557,000 exarchates, which Greek exegetes rush to identify against Greeks and Bulgars. Then you refer to Hilmi Pasha, who you claim has done a pretty good job in identifying 52% of Macedonians being in some way related to a Muslim faith. And then you end the paragraph by saying, while 30.8% of the population was in fact Bulgarian speaking, a mere 10.5% spoke Greek. My question is, how did you find this research to find this, which I commend you highly? And can you expand how, where you pointed out where these, in fact, you continue the line, you say, when the Greeks marched north into Macedonia, their goal was to liberate slightly more than 10% of the population. So can you explain this phenomenon and the difference between the patriarchs, the exarchates, and how this led to the confusion of the census figures?
Oh, how much more time do we have? First of all, let me refer you to footnote number 140, which is at the bottom of that paragraph, which it's, of course, is a Greek source. Some of you who are somehow active in this movement know of a man called Dimitris Lithoxou, who was a Greek living in Athens, who was one of the few Greeks that speaks openly and publicly on this matter and publishes on it as well. He's a gentleman that I met when I was in Greece and who gave me some of his books. They aren't published by large publishers, they're published by tiny publishers and only in very small press runs. But I've given the title of it here in Greek, to Makedoniko Zitime ki συγκρότηση του ελληνικού εθνικού μύθου in Ελληνικός ethnikismos Makedoniko Zitime, which means the Macedonian question and the construction of the Greek national myth, which he sees somehow at the heart of the construction of the Greek national myth, which is what I was trying to to allude to in my remarks to you. I'm sure you're all much more familiar with the difference between the patriarchists and the exarchists than I am. But if memory serves me right, it was in 1867 that the Caliph in Istanbul, acceding to the demands of the Bulgarian-speaking members of the Orthodox Church, then ruled by the Patriarchate, said, we want a Bulgarian-identified church. So it was by royal decree, by a firman, that Istanbul accorded existence to the Exarchate, which was ostensibly Bulgarian-speaking. One of the reasons for that was that the Patriarchate had become nationalistic Greek by its definition. It had ceased to become the religious authority to which all members of Orthodoxy, with which all members of Orthodoxy could identify, and had become a vehicle for Hellenism. And my understanding was that the people of the Balkans, not only Bulgarians, Macedonians, but also Serbs and Albanians, were increasingly reluctant to accept not only the language, which was the language of the liturgy, but also now the nationalistic message that was coming with that language in the mouths of priests, archimandrates, and bishops. I think that in a short and rather summary way is what happened. But it also happened that a lot of people who were still patriarchists were not necessarily Greek speakers. And a fair number of Greek speakers may have been exarchists, or people who spoke two languages, depending on who they were talking to. Let's say that you had to speak for commercial reasons Greek, but that at home you didn't speak. You spoke Macedonian, or Bulgarian, or Serbian, or Albanian, or Vlach. But you said you were a Greek. We all know this phenomenon exists. I can understand how it would be necessary for many Macedonians living in Greece today to say, no, I'm a Greek. I can understand how all of this may be operative. And I think given the climate, excuse me if I can just finish my train of thought, given the climate of the Balkan Wars and the years that preceded it, when there was a heavy price to pay if you identified yourself incorrectly, you can see how people would be very sensitive about that, about saying who they were, and how unscrupulous people could use this information against those people, file it in the back of their minds, So that when the troops march in, they'd have everybody labeled. Aha, they are this. And then you visit the house. This is my understanding of roughly what the procedure was. But this would take an entire other lecture, which I would have to do research on. So I'm not exactly prepared to do that right now. I hope you'll let me off.
I was altar boy in the church of Istanbul, which was exarchist. And the reason for the division was, originally, they wanted to have the language on their own. And most of the Macedonians, they were the people who produced the uniforms for the Turkish army. And so when they went on strike, actually the Sultan sent his secretary, who was from Russian origin. His name was Stefan Bogoridi. And the church name at the moment is Saint Stefan, because he donated his house to be able to build the church.
This is the famous Iron Church in
Yes,
Istanbul. Yes,
yes,
yes.
yes. And so basically the exarchist group was trying to separate themselves and become identity of a new nation, because Bulgaria at that time was not independent country yet. And they had a publishing printing press across the church. It was a building which I saw part of this printing press pieces, still existed. It wasn't in working order. So basically, once Bulgaria became independent, their policy was to support the exarchist idea, which they sent some of the teachers and priests into whole Macedonia. That was the theory of Bulgarian influence in Macedonian, and presently some of the arguments in the Macedonia Republic, because somebody is Bulgarian or Macedonian, all this started from the separation of the patriarchies and exarchies. And patriarchies, basically, they said we have a tradition to obey the patriarch. We are not going to follow the exarchies. And this indirectly become a political instrument to influence the situation. And when they divided the Macedonian after the First Balkan or Second Balkan War, separation was because original agreement was to divide Albania basically between Greece and Serbia. And yet, when Albania was not available because the Austro-Hungarian Empire said you cannot do this thing, so they had to divide Macedonia. And this was the reason for division after the First War. And when you see how these three countries are attaching themselves to the First War, Bulgaria decided that Germans are going to be the winners, number one, so we can get all the territories from Macedonia. Serbia and Greece decided that Britain is much more stronger, so we are on that side. Comes Second World War, same situation. History repeats itself because people have the same mentality and same objective, and hoping that this time we may win the...
Yeah.
But you have to say that the Bulgarians had a talent for betting on the wrong horse.
Yes. I don't want to insult anybody here, but I think that even they would admit it. How did we do that?
I understand we can talk about it forever.
Clearly, yeah.
One more, okay.
I'm going to sit down on it.
Is it possible that the 648,000 patriarchs, what percentage would be Macedonians? I mean, they could go to the patriarch's church, and then logically, what percent of the 557? In other words, in these figures, is this where this hidden, non-existent culture and society occurred because of the use of these terms?
That's one of the areas of ambiguity, the areas of darkness, of shadow, of concealment.
In other words, here's the most optimistic thing. Could it be that 90% of the patriarchs were in fact Macedonians, ethno-cultural Macedonians, and in fact 90% of the exarchists were as well Macedonians?
I wouldn't even want to possibly comment on that. But I'm sure even as we speak that in Skopje that people are examining through very sophisticated computer programs these figures, you know, giving them... Well, I said before that I think that there are more dopyi, natives, locals, many more than the Greeks would care to admit. This is my gut feeling. If you say that there's one or two people in a given town who might speak this language, then you can assume that behind them there's a lot. If you get a call of complaint, if you're running a company, someone calls to complain about your product, it's assumed that behind that complaint there are X number of unexpressed complaints. And I think we can make the same assumption with regard to this. What those numbers are, I don't know. I'm just saying that my own personal feeling, which is an unscientific one, I don't claim to be a scientist and I wouldn't want to put that hat on. I wouldn't know how to read that. I think it's dangerous for us to say, to read back into the past the knowledge that we have today. Did people say, I am a Macedonian 150 years ago? Did they even say, I'm a Bulgarian or I'm a Greek? Frankly, I doubt it. People might have said, I'm a Christian and I speak this language. Or I'm a Muslim. But some went from one to the other. Dear old Skanderbeg, the national hero of Albania, you know, fought for the Turks, and he was a Turk for a long time. And then he changed sides again and went back to Albania. And so he was one and then the other. He was a great military leader for the Turks, and he was the national hero of Albania. So go figure. Which I'm not saying everybody is like Skanderbeg, but nonetheless, you know, there's that.
We've got a couple more questions. And
Okay. I'm getting...
You said that you were traveling through Greece with a companion. Just the Greek government assigned you a companion to travel through, not a companion, but a guide. It kind of gives me a feeling of the Nazis showing the camps to the world and kind of reading up the... No, I said that who was traveling with you?
Oh, no, no. With my wife, or with my wife and my two kids, or by myself? Strictly. Strictly, always, always. Definitely. That's at least I have, since I speak Greek, I don't need an interpreter. I can have direct communication. If someone says, Ohi, then I understand what that means, you know. I just show up, get on the bus and go there. Yeah. Definitely.
One more question. Just for the record, can you tell us your background? Ethnicity, your ethnicity, where you were, and little details about the book. Were you writing as a journalist by your own enthusiasm and stimul, or you're guided by some institution or country or state?
Okay. Or
That's one thing. And another is you traveled back recently to Asia. Did you go back to Greece and Macedonia? Okay, but the picture you had when you wrote the book, and this time, from the time of publishing up to now, you're getting different pictures of Macedonia and Macedonian questions.
the first question is, who am I? And I have to say that I work... Pardon me? Well, I'm a CIA agent, but I also work for the... Hold on. I also work for the International Zionist Conspiracy. Both of those things. And this has been said about me in the Greek community. For instance. So that's all the information you need, right? No, I'm a former American. I left the United States. I came to Canada. I've been living here since then. I now consider myself more a Quebecer than a Canadian. I'm in favor of Quebec independence. That should be obvious.
Why did you pick Quebec?
It picked me. My children grew up there, and if you bring up children in a place, then you quickly understand, or you should quickly understand more about it. But that doesn't concern us here. But I tried to explain that I have a long history of affection for Greece, and I haven't lost any of that. But the deeper you dig, the further you go, the more you come across this other dimension, yes? The one that we're talking about here today. And I tried to outline at the beginning of my talk what that process was in the most general possible way. So without boring you with repetition of all those details, that you could say that the one led somehow inevitably to the other. If you seek to understand a situation, you have to dig down and down and down, and the deeper you dig, the more you find pardon me? Or the less Greece, the way it's defined, you know. I don't think that's to slight anybody. I don't think that's to deny the existence of anybody else. To say that because we are who we are, that so-and-so does not also exist. No, I won't say it. But they can't argue that with regard to us either. You know, that's the thing that I feel badly about, that that something is askew. The balance is not right. What was the second question? I've forgotten, Tony. Well, I hope to go back, as I said, in late March or early April. And at that time, if someone wants to invite me to come again and speak, then I will. And I'll say, here's what I found when I was in Skopje for 3 days. You know. But I wish to, when I do go, I will hopefully also write a series of articles for the French press on the subject, on what I find.
I would like to tell you about my ghost town, my village. It was 250 people, or houses I should say, and they were burned in 1949. And all of the village, the people from the village were in Romania, in Russia, in Yugoslavia, in all over the world, in here of course, and Australia. And the Greeks went and dug the cemetery and put all the bones in the church. That's the only thing that was left, the church, the school, the two, I should say. So all the bones from the people that were born there, they are in the basement of the church, and they built a new village on the cemetery.
What building?
Someday.
No comment.
Well,
no comment.
I would like to thank you all. I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
Bring him back.
Talking about something that's so dear to us about Macedonia and about the Macedonian question. However, I would just also like to say that there is a videotape we're making right now, and it's going to be available for sale. There are videotapes available from other lectures. There is going to be signing. Whoever wants to purchase a book, they can purchase a book and get, of course, signature by Suri. And also we have Macedonian tea, so please feel free, it's in the kitchen there. And once again, I really would like to say thank you so much.